My sister was texting me, "Mom needs her bag. Where are you?" And I was sitting in a casino. I won the most money I'd ever won in that week, and I'd lost all of it. It was just like, it broke me. I was ready to leave this earth.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the One Day at a Time podcast. Today, I have a special guest. Her name is Christina Cook, and we're going to be talking about lived experience with gambling harm. Christina, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I always like doing these things with you and just talking about our own experiences and how we can help others.
And I appreciate you coming on because we've done interviews in the past, and I'm glad that we're getting this one down now that I have a studio that doesn't look like I just threw it together in 5 minutes or I was living in a dark cave somewhere. So hopefully this one finds the audience that it needs to find. But to give context to people that haven't heard one of our previous conversations, like, who are you and what do you do right now?
Yeah, I'm Christina, and I think a lot of the work that I do that people might recognize me from is my podcast, The Broke Girl Society, which is geared towards women who are experiencing gambling harms and looking for support and recovery and resources and all that good stuff. But my own journey of gambling harm is kind of what led me to this space. I struggled with gambling for about 15 years, the last half of that being very destructive to my emotional, physical, mental, financial health. And so once I found recovery, it kind of sparked this passion in me to help others find recovery too.
Were you always someone that gambled or did you kind of pick it up like later on?
Yeah, no, I didn't start gambling until I was around 28. So a little bit of background: I'm in Oklahoma, and gambling really wasn't a staple of this state until the early 2000s when casinos were approved and started to be built. We had like bingo halls and we had a couple of racetracks, so it wasn't something that I really saw other people doing. It just very limited. And I remember my mom having bingo nights occasionally, but it was never anything that ever really interested me. I'd been to Vegas a couple of times. Like, it is what it is, Vegas, a couple of days. That's about it. And I don't even really remember gambling when I went to Vegas prior. Like, it just wasn't anything on my radar. Along with, and I just want to say this for backstory, like addiction in general. I didn't really experience somebody going through addiction. So I didn't really have this kind of self-awareness of things that I mean, like, yeah, I grew up in the, I'm going to age myself, but the DARE program, right? Like, where they would come in and they would talk about, drugs and alcohol. And that was just, you got that little 30-minute conversation and you got the t-shirt and, so that was really my experience. So I guess I'm fortunate in a way that I didn't see addiction firsthand in any real capacity. But then, it also kind of what led into my harm for so long, because I didn't think that gambling could be something addictive or harmful.
So it's just set in the backstory here. It's your late 20s and you're finding yourself gambling for the first time. What is it that you started to gamble on? And what did you feel the first time you were doing it, if you remember?
Yeah, I actually do remember. So I said that casinos started kind of being built around the early 2000s. For context, Oklahoma has 145, 46 casinos now. So that's how much progress we've made in that much time with casinos. But they had just built one just kind of not far from my house. And like I said, I was 28 and I found myself single after a divorce. And, I was kind of disconnected from my friends who were getting married or having babies. I wasn't really connecting with the conversation about cute baby shoes and all these things. I'd just gone through a painful divorce. And so I had been up to that casino a few times with friends, like on a birthday. Like, I'm talking like maybe 2 or 3 times since it was built. Girls' night. And I remember the very first time I walked in to the casino, the smoke smell hit me so hard. And, not being a smoker, it really impacted me a little bit. Back in that day, way back when in the early 2000s, they didn't really have great air systems, filtration systems. So it was like you literally were walking into a room full of just smoke. And so I struggled with that a bit as somebody with asthma. But I remember sitting at the machines, and granted, because it was so new, it was so crowded and it's limited machines. You're literally just fighting in line to sit down. And I didn't like that either. But I sat down and it was a slot machine, because that was my issue with slots. I've never had, even now, I don't have any other thoughts of any other type of gambling. And it was like a 5 reel game, and I don't want to really get into the game because I don't want to trigger anybody, but it was fine. I spent $5. I think I was offered $5 of free play. And so after all that was gone, I was just disgusted. I wanted out of there. I hated the smell. I hated that I lost. I mean, I just remember betting like 60 cents and feeling sick to my stomach of like, oh, like I can't believe I just lost this money. Like I had walked out of there previous times, just not engaged with it, not really caring about it, a little bit disgusted by it, to be honest. But then, so fast forward, I don't know, several months later, I'm single. I'm not somebody that's going to go to the bars. I was just looking for something to do to get out of the house, and it felt like, oh, that felt kind of safe and it was really well lit. I could go, and if I wanted to have a drink there, I could, or visit with some friends that were up there. And so I started going as a way to just kind of get out of the house every once in a while, and just started kind of, yeah, small. I don't think it really became I mean, hindsight is always the important part here, right? It was probably a good year before I might have started to feel some impacts from it. Like maybe wasn't getting money into savings because I was just spending a little bit too much on what I thought was just entertainment, right? But again, it's like all hindsight of like, that's probably when the harm started to really happen.
So it sounds like gambling was almost just like an alternative to being kind of bored. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say boredom was a huge part of it, just looking for something to do. But also, looking back on it now, I didn't want to sit with my feelings from the divorce, from maybe
Mm.
the disconnection from my friends. My mom was also experiencing a lot of health issues. Right about the same time, she'd had her first heart attack.
Wow.
And I was raised by a single mom, and she's everything to me. And there was a lot of hard feelings around that as well.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, sorry that was going on. Gambling as an escape almost might be a better way to say it than instead of gambling for boredom. But I'm sure a lot of people listening can probably relate to that to an extent. Did you care at all during this time what your actual chances of winning were? Or was it just about the way it felt?
Yeah, no, I never had that idea that I was going to win big. Like I never had that thing of like, oh, I'm going to win, so much money and I'm going to be able to take care of things. And I never had that intention. Really, for me, it was just one, being social. And this is it, and how it transitions throughout the 15 years is very different. So in the beginning, it was boredom. It was socialization with people who were doing the same thing I was doing. I became friends with all the people that worked there. It gave me a sense of like community when my community was kind of different than what I needed. But then there was that escapism as well of like not wanting to sit at home, not wanting to feel the feels of being left out while everybody else is moving forward. And so, I mean, it's very, I think a lot of people's situation around gambling or addiction in general, compulsion, however anybody identifies, it's very complex.
Going right back to the beginning there, a lot of people seem to, especially nowadays, be drawn in by these free plays and free offers. Do you feel like you were being lured in by the free plays, or did you even just not even think about it at all during the time?
Oh, absolutely. And I've always said, even when I entered recovery, I had a lot of anger towards the industry. And by industry, I mean operators and such. But, recovery taught me where my accountability needs to be. And that is with me. But that doesn't mean that they don't make the yellow brick road to problem gambling that much easier. They light the path. And so, yeah, definitely. The free play would 9 times out of 10, if I told myself, I'm not going to play this week, I'm going to try and take a break. And then it's like somehow I get an email that said, hey, you have $50 in free play. And I'm like, in my mind, my addicted mind, for lack of a better word, and again, anybody can identify however, I identify as an addiction. So my addicted brain was like, well, you can't let that $50 go. I mean, you lost so much money. Like you have to try and at least get some of it back with this. So even though I wasn't, just to kind of refer back to that earlier question, I wasn't looking to win big. I was always looking to pay myself back.
I can't even begin to guess how many people watching have told themselves, "I'll quit after I get even," or "I need to get that money back." I mean, it's our gold staple, standard go-to sentence that we'll say to ourselves. But that was even before, like, these algorithms that track your play and provide, like, really strong incentives, right? So this was all happening just on their basic marketing cold call list,
Yeah.
email list?
Yeah, and, you get connected with somebody if you use the cards and,
Mm.
you get, like, the VIP perks and things like that, and I never really got very far in my card level because I always forgot the dang thing. But, and honestly, I mean, I never had it, and I don't know how many of those little ropes that they would tie to the card, and it wouldn't matter, I'd leave it. Like, that just wasn't me, but I also wasn't tracking my taxes very well because that was just a whole 'nother issue, so maybe if I'd been more mindful about that, it would have helped, but for me, it was very much just you got a weekly flyer.
Mm.
Like every week, it was consistent. So I knew what my free plays were going to be, what my free food options were going to be every week. And, even on those times where I might have had moments, I don't remember a whole lot of them in the earlier days, but where I'd be like, oh, you can't go this weekend. You're already behind on this. You're already not doing this.
Mm.
And then I would see that flyer and I would be like, well, I mean, it's an opportunity to kind of win back, but also to kind of connect with what you said, like I always kind of had a number in my head that if I would win a certain amount, it would kind of pay me back or help me get out of the hole I dug. But I shifted that number every time because I won that number a
Yeah.
couple of times. I won that number and it didn't matter. It was that realization, I think, that kind of left me feeling down and not great was the fact that there really isn't a number.
No.
Like,
We moved the
it's never
goalpost.
gonna be enough. Yeah.
Yeah, it's no win is big enough to satisfy the addicted gambler. It's straight out of the literature.
Yeah.
It's exactly how I felt as well. But with these offers coming in, I can't help but think at the time, did it feel like it was did it give you a sense of importance at all that they wanted you to come back in and give it another try? Because it did for me. I'm just wondering if it made you feel maybe like maybe it was filling a social void, maybe it was filling something for you?
No, like, it is different for me, but I get what you're saying, and I think if I had maybe been like, I know somebody, and I'm not gonna connect how I know them, but, somebody personally that had, like, a black card, like a
Mm,
black player's card, and, like, the perks, like, had special parking, um, got to eat in a separate area that was just catered to them. You know what I mean? Those VIP perks. And I would see that and I'd be a little jealous of like, why am I not getting that? Like I've played probably because I was secret with my addiction. I'd be like, I played probably more than that person has played.
mm,
And I would just kind of get a little bit ruffled by that. But
okay.
at the same time, I didn't ever think it was
Mhm.
personal. Like I never looked at it as like they're personally reaching out to me. I'm just a name on our flyer list, on their flyer list. And it's even now, I think it's important to address that even if you think that that's the connection you want to hang on to, that you've made these great friends with the marketing people or the VIP people,
Mhm.
like really at the end of the day, you're a quota for them. That's part of their job. And I don't want to downplay anybody's relationships, but when you stop gambling and you self exclude from all of those things, those relationships are gone.
Yeah.
And it's just important to remember that.
Absolutely. It's I don't know if you've seen in the news recently, a man named Amit Patel is suing FanDuel for damages because he had a VIP host who kept him coming back. This is what they're alleging. The VIP host kept him coming back over and over again, despite the fact that they knew he had a gambling problem. I've actually been in touch with his lawyer for a while now. His name's Matthew Litt, and that is playing out right now in the New York courts. But the implication of it, even if it doesn't result in anything for Mr. Patel is that if you know someone has a problem and you keep them coming back with these incentives, where all along that line is your responsibility as the operator?
Right.
And so that's kind of the question that I was getting at with this aside, but I'll steer us back the other direction now. We're at this point in your story where you're picking up offers, you're going back to the casino on a regular basis, and you're playing slots. When did things, kind of hit a bottom or a peak in the terms of the amount of gambling, the feelings you got from it? When did the negatives really start to come in?
I think the negatives probably came in earlier than I can really even recognize in this conversation. I mean, obviously, Here's the thing with my own journey is like I've never been financially great. Like I've never been somebody who was like I have a twin sister, okay? She's blonde-headed and green-eyed. We look as different as we are. And she has always been just financially in a good space. She's always kind of thought about her future and, debt and those types of things. And I've always been compulsive in nature when it comes to finances. So I'm sharing this as a way to say this is probably why I didn't pick up on the financial harms of my gambling because it felt just like me being financially irresponsible, like I've always been. So I think, looking back at it, that's how I kept kind of rationalizing the behaviors and the harms that I was experiencing is I just kept thinking, well, I'm just financially, you know, bad at stuff.
It's a money
And
problem,
yeah, it's a
not a
money
gambling
problem,
problem.
not an emotional problem, not a gambling problem, but it's a financial problem. And that's what I kept telling myself a lot of times. So really, there were harms throughout definitely throughout, but the first part of it wasn't as like I was still paying my bills. I was still managing in some capacity. I wasn't borrowing money really at this point to feed my gambling. I say that in a way, but I was also gambling with my mom and I would probably borrow money from her when we were gambling. But it was right about that 7-year mark that I can really kind of gauge because I can look back at just when I started falling behind on like just simple like things that we need to do as a society, like file my taxes, right? Like I started letting those very important things not be important to me anymore. Taking care of my home, I've always been somebody who has taken care of her home. And like I'm talking about decor, changing out seasonal things, just a typical girl likes to dress up her home. And, I remember just thinking there probably 10 years into my addiction that I had furniture that looked like it was years and years old. We moved and I didn't put anything on the walls. Like I never hung curtains. It's just like I remember having a moment looking around my space thinking, this isn't me. This isn't, but not having the desire to do anything about it. So it's like that's how I started to kind of notice like the mental health impacts of my gambling and things like that. But I had also gone through a lot of life experiences in this period. I was in a very abusive relationship, and I haven't really touched a lot on that abuse because I'm still unwrapping it myself. It wasn't an abuse that I could define by physical abuse. You know what I mean? Where somebody's like, I couldn't say I've been hit. I couldn't say I had no other markings or scars to show the abuse that I had been experiencing because it was mental. It was verbal. It was a very challenging time in my life and there was a lot of control. I felt like my own gambling I had control of because I didn't feel I had control in a lot of areas of my life because of the relationships I'd put myself in, like just experiencing a lot of things. And so for me, the gambling was the one thing I was hanging on to that gave me comfort. So all the problems and everything it was causing me, I was justifying because of everything else I was experiencing. So it was the one thing I thought I had control over. It was the one thing that I just wasn't willing to let go of because it was the one thing I was using to cope with just life and everything I was going through, things I didn't have a voice to explain, you know?
Hmm. If you're watching this video right now and you can relate to finding control in a situation that is more or less completely uncontrollable, then you're in the right place. Because I hear this all the time and I felt the same way. It's like we're in control when we're gambling and nowhere else in our lives. Then we look at the statistics and the reality of the gambling and we're way out of control.
Right.
So it's like the emotional control that you get from finally making the decision that, hey, this is terrible, but at least I'm controlling the fact that I'm experiencing this horrible thing and not something else that's beyond my control. I mean, it's just so like it's a pattern that's across so many people's gambling story. It's incredible to hear out loud. But I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. At this point, like, you're trying to find control in the uncontrollable. Is gambling the only thing that's bringing you that feeling? Is there anything else at all in life that's making you feel okay at the time, or is it really just gambling?
It really was just gambling, honestly. For me, it was the only, like, it felt like my only refuge. And I think a lot of people don't think about when they decide to quit gambling, right? They make those steps and they enter recovery. They don't understand, like, sometimes when you go into this space and you feel this very deep void, right? Because gambling becomes your best friend in a lot of ways. It becomes this thing that's kind of always been with you, good or bad, right? I look at my gambling now, it was less about control and more about self harm for me. Like, I was kind of harming myself with my gambling behaviors because I couldn't fight for myself in any other capacity of my life. I was just so knocked down and broken, which is how I identify. And, so I can go on all kinds of rants about how gambling played a part in my life. But I think one of the biggest steps that I had to take with my gambling was a grief process of grieving the fact that it can't be in my life anymore, because I am a person who knows that I can never gamble again. If I gamble again, my life will be just as chaotic and upside down as it was 3.5 years ago. And I personally don't want to go back there. So I will continue to do everything I can to keep moving forward. But one of the processes for me was just really recognizing the grief I was feeling about the loss of gambling. And as sick as that sounds, like, how could you mourn something that hurt you? And it's like, I think we all need to go through kind of a let go process, especially if it's been, I know you hear stories where it's only been in somebody's life 3 months, but it's caused tremendous harm. But it was in my life 15 years. It went through three different relationships with me. It went through, or two different relationships with me. It went through, loss and grief of losing my grandmother, who was very close to it. Helped me get through struggles with my mom. I remember that episode with my mom when she was in the hospital after her first heart attack. It was like day 2 she was in the hospital. I remember wanting to gamble to escape my feelings around that. And that was the day I won my first jackpot. And my mom was in the hospital. My sister was texting me, "Mom needs her bag. Mom needs this. Where are you?" And I was sitting in a casino playing a game because I was so overwhelmed by what I just went through with my mom. That memory still sets with me. And that's kind of, I think, for me, when I really, that first jackpot, that emotional experience, it just clenched it for me.
I can relate to that kind of experience. I remember leaving my grandmother's funeral and I was carrying my phone and I was checking scores of a baseball game that I put a bet on before the funeral started. And then once it ended, I was checking to see if I had won. It's like we're never thinking about what's going on because we're trying to bring everything back inwards to avoid it. And I mean, thanks for sharing that as well, because that's an experience that a lot of people can probably relate to some extent, is pushing aside outward responsibilities to get that feeling of escape, that breath that we tell ourselves that we need. So you say that you're someone that can never gamble again. What would you say to someone that says, why can't you just bet smaller amounts or bet with a budget? Like, why couldn't you stick with it?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the brain science is behind it. But I set the time, the budget limits, all those things that responsible gambling people tell you to do. Set a time. And really, if you're not struggling or it's not a problem, 90% of the population can do it normally. But if you're starting to push those boundaries or those limits or whatever you set for yourself, then it becomes a problem. But compulsive gambling or disordered gambling, problem gambling, it's a disease that progresses. I remember having those moments where 60 cents was making me sick, to betting $60 to spend at the end of my gambling. And it's like that progression, it's scary. Even though mine was a lot slower than a lot of people's, sometimes it becomes more of a wildfire after that first jackpot. Then it's like, oh, it's on. For me, it was a very slow progression. It was a very slow build of how much gambling and I pieced gambling into my life. So I think that that's a lot of it. It was so ingrained in everything I did that, to untangle myself from it, that was a whole process. And so to add it back into my life, even in small doses, and we're not here to tell you to gamble or not gamble. We're just here to tell you our own experiences and the harm that potentially could happen, and to help you recognize if you're experiencing harm earlier in the journey. You know what I mean? To kind of help keep you from getting as far down the hole as I did or Rob did. I think I just know for me that to bring gambling back in my life would just never work out. It would always be a harmful thing for myself. Just like an alcoholic can't introduce alcohol after they've struggled, got to the point where they've hit the rock bottom. They can't just walk into a bar and order a drink and be okay. It usually starts the downhill slide. So that's how I connect with it. Do I think harm reduction can be helpful? In 1% of people, it can be. But I think it depends on how much harm they're experiencing and, what they're willing to do to negate that harm.
But, when did it start to get better? What have you done since that point, and where are you today?
Yeah. So, it was the end of 2020, beginning of 21, and I really started to just recognize my gambling harms. And I was just so sick and tired of being sick and tired. Like, I know you've heard that probably so many times, but that's the truth of it. You get to the point where you're just so tired of just being completely controlled and knocked down by something that really should have no impact on your life whatsoever. And I think it was just kind of that recognition. So I think it was after I was watching, or I had a binge, right? Lost my paycheck. And now I was in that struggle of like, what am I going to do for the next 2 weeks? And how am I going to tell my partner at the time, husband at the time, like what I just did. And I was watching, it was probably like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I was watching a show about food addiction. And people are always surprised to hear this because, like I said, and I mentioned earlier on, like I didn't really have an idea of addiction. Like, yeah, I knew what I'd seen, been taught, but I didn't have any real life experience of it. And I was watching the show, and this woman was talking about how she felt before she ate, how she felt during eating, and how she felt afterwards. So before was that, oh, can't wait, thinking about it. And then while eating, it's like, man, this is amazing. You get that euphoria. And then afterwards, the self-loathing of like, she just literally ate 3 pizzas. And it's like the self-loathing, the like, I can't believe I did this. Why do I keep harming myself like this? I broke down in tears watching that because I connected with every single emotion she shared. And it just kind of like, it was that aha moment for me. And so I just made a vow to myself like, hey, I'm going to stop. I'm really going to actively try and stop. Because prior to that, I've changed a lot of areas of my life thinking that that was the problem, not the gambling. It was that kind of that acceptance moment of like, okay, we got to look at the gambling. Like, as much as I don't want it to change, as much as I do want it to change, we need to look at it. And I made it about 60 days, give or take a day. I don't know. I had a real stressful event or something happened and it triggered me. And I gambled. It sent me on a week-long binge. I won the most money I'd ever won in that week, and I'd lost all of it. And it was just like, it broke me. I was ready to leave this earth. And, I'd had previous thoughts, but these thoughts were really scaring me because it felt so real. And so I knew, that I couldn't do that to my family. I couldn't do it to my mom. And so I reached out and I told my mom the very next day. I said, I'm struggling. And she knew I had a problem with gambling. Her and my sisters had talked about doing an intervention. They didn't really know the extent of my struggle. They just knew that I was borrowing money from them. I wasn't paying it back. I was lying all the time. And they knew that that wasn't me. And I'm so thankful that they just kept seeing through it and kept saying, okay, we're going to figure this out. And she just sat down with me and we talked it out. And, I felt lighter. She felt heavier, but she said, we're going to make a plan. And we did. And so I called GA, found a therapist, went to my first meeting. And from then on, it was just like, it's been all momentum forward. And I know that that's not the case for everyone. So, don't compare your journey to mine. It's just how mine happened to work out. I found podcasts. My friend Tara, who does the Ambitious Addicts podcast, Beyond the 12 Steps, she reached out to me, asked me to come on. I loved the experience. I loved her. And that started the podcast journey. And I thought, you know what? I could talk about this. I wasn't finding a lot of women in this space talking about gambling harm and all the things that I think women need to address when they're in recovery. It can look different than what men, like, I don't believe there's a one size fits all approach to recovery. I think we all need to kind of figure it out, be curious, navigate it. If 12-step program works for you, great. If, podcasts and group support work for you, great. Don't let anybody tell you what's right or wrong. So I went on this discovery journey of what was going to work for me. And I knew that I needed more women in my life who had been struggling with this, who had overcome it. I thought, well, I'm going to share my journey along the way. That started the podcast, which led to the Facebook group, which is the Broke Girl Society on Facebook, where I think almost 2,500 women now who are in there supporting each other, talking about gambling harm, sharing resources, sharing things that have helped them, but also just sharing everyday struggles that women face and seeking support to help navigate them. So I do a lot of that. I'm set on a lot of boards that navigate gambling harm in the space. I do a lot of talks about women in gambling, about my own story. And yeah, I wear a lot of hats in this space, but I'm so grateful to be in this space doing this work, passionate about this work.
Well, I'm sure that many can join me in saying that we're grateful that you're doing the work that you do. A few things that you touched on. So, if anyone does reach the point where they're considering taking their own life, please check the description of this video for a link to the 988 Suicide Crisis Helpline website. We're going to link it all up. Additionally, in the description, we're going to add links to all of Christina's groups and her podcasts. So, go and check them out as well. Christina, I want to ask, where would you be if you didn't pursue recovery? What would have happened if you were to guess?
Well, other than maybe possibly not being here anymore, I mean, the chaos, right? The chaos would still be ensuing. And I get scared to think about that because I can't imagine how I remember how I felt, like just not wanting to exist. Like I wasn't living, I was just surviving. And I just didn't want to feel like that anymore. So I don't know where I would be. I think I would still either be in the cycle of chaos or not here anymore. And one thing I do want to say is I know that a lot of people who've struggled with addiction or gambling or however they identify, like those dark feelings, they come and they go, and sometimes they hang around for a little while. But I just want to put out the message that we're never alone. We're never alone. There is support. There are people out there who can navigate us through these emotions. You can find hope in all of our stories that, hey, we've been there. We know how you feel. And we've pulled ourselves up and we're continuing to move forward. And you absolutely are not alone. And there is help.
At this point, you've probably done a couple hundred of these conversations, this one included. What keeps you motivated to keep talking about gambling harm?
The version of me that was sitting in their car, struggling to continue to move forward, who just needed a bit of hope. I can still feel every emotion I felt sitting in my car that night, making that decision of like something has to change. So I do it for that person who's just like caught in the struggle, who's just surviving. They're not living. They're just surviving. Yeah, that's my whole motivation, to just try and help move somebody from that space to a space where they're actually living, they're thriving, they're building a life that they don't want to escape from.
So we're filming this on National Mental Health Day. And in honor of that, I wanted to finish up by asking you, if someone is experiencing these problems, but they think that seeking help is a sign of weakness, or they're a loser, or they're giving up, what would you say to them? And note, they might be right on that fence of it being a real problem and it being something that they think they can deal with.
It's always a tough one. So if somebody were to come to me and they're like, I don't know that it's really a problem, but I'm starting to kind of recognize that I'm spending a little too much time, because there are some people that it doesn't financially impact, right? But it impacts their relationships because they're isolating or they're not spending enough time at home or whatever the situation is. So if somebody's just kind of right on the cusp of, that's if you can catch them on that cuff. Like, I think that's always the $1 million question is, how do we prevent the harm? And it's like, I don't know. I think for me, I would just say really focus on your values, your goals that you have for your own life, your financial goals, your family goals. Gambling shouldn't impact anything we do in our life. It shouldn't dictate whether or not we have enough money to buy groceries. It shouldn't dictate whether or not we get money into savings. It shouldn't dictate where we go on vacation. Like, gambling should have no say-so in your life at all. It is meant to be entertainment. Just like you go to the movies once a month or every couple of months, that's exactly how gambling should be. And so it's really just defining that relationship and saying, hey, this is something I really like to do. You have to set those blocks and put those things in place to keep it safe if that's something you want to continue to do, and just constantly check in with yourself and see if your behaviors around gambling match the goals that you want in your own life, values that you have in your own life. So it's really about kind of holding space for what's important in
Mm.
your life, and seeing where gambling fits into that. And again, it shouldn't impact any decision making in your life whatsoever. It shouldn't impact it. If it's impacting it in any way, it's a problem.
Mm.
Simple as that. And it needs to be addressed.
I always say if it's not fun, it should be done. So
Yeah.
I
When the
think
fun stops, stop. That's
easier said than done, of course.
right.
Well, everyone, I hope that you check out Christina's podcast, The Broke Girl Society. And until we figure out everything in this world, let's just keep getting better together, one day at a time.